Central Vietnam. The war had been burning for years. Villages turned to ash, rivers red with silt, skies heavy with the sound of helicopters. From above, it looked endless. But on the morning of March 16th, one pilot saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His name was Hugh Thompson Jr., a 24-year-old U.S. Army helicopter pilot from Georgia. He'd flown hundreds of missions before, rescues, evacuations, supply drops. But that morning, his mission was simple: fly reconnaissance over a small village called My Lai. From the air, My Lai looked quiet. Rows of palm trees, rice paddies, glinting like mirrors under the sun. Smoke rising from cooking fires. To any outsider, it looked like a normal morning in the countryside. But as Thompson's helicopter approached, something felt wrong. The closer he flew, the clearer it became. The smoke wasn't from cooking fires, it was from burning homes. The fields weren't full of farmers, they were scattered with bodies, unarmed villagers lying motionless in the dirt. Thompson blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There were American soldiers down there, his own countrymen, moving through the village, rifles drawn. But the people they were shooting at weren't soldiers, they were women, children, the elderly, people running for their lives. He circled once more, hoping it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But the longer he watched, the clearer the horror became. He could see women clutching infants, men trying to shield their families, and soldiers, American soldiers, opening fire without hesitation. From his cockpit, Thompson's voice broke through the radio. "My God, what are they doing down there?" No one answered. He knew what he was supposed to do. Keep flying, report back, follow orders, but orders meant nothing when what you saw defied every human instinct. He looked at his crew, door gunner Lawrence Colburn and crew chief Glenn Andreotta, and made a choice few could even imagine in that moment. He turned to them and said quietly, "Land the helicopter, now." In the next minute, the sound of rotor blades cut through the screams below. The helicopter dropped lower, dust swirling around it, and as it touched down between the soldiers and the surviving villagers, a 24-year-old pilot prepared to do something that would forever change how the world remembered My Lai, not as just a tragedy, but as proof that even in war, there can still be humanity. The air was thick with smoke and confusion as Hugh Thompson's helicopter lowered into the chaos. Below, soldiers were moving through the village methodically, their uniforms dark with mud and sweat, their rifles rising and falling with every burst of gunfire. The cries of villagers echoed between the trees, short, terrified, fading. As the skids touched the ground, Thompson's heart pounded against his chest. He wasn't trained for this. No manual, no briefing, no commander had ever told him what to do when the enemy turned out to be your own side. He unbuckled, leaned out the cockpit window, and shouted toward a group of soldiers ahead, "Hold your fire! These people are unarmed!" For a moment, no one moved. The gunfire faltered. Then one man, an American lieutenant, turned and glared back. His face was hard, his uniform smeared with dust. He shouted something Thompson couldn't fully hear over the rotor wash, but the meaning was clear. "Get out of here. Mind your own business." But Thompson didn't move. He stood his ground, or rather held it, his helicopter sitting like a barrier between the armed men and the huddled villagers behind him. He turned to his crew. "Keep your guns trained on them," he said quietly. "On the Americans. If they fire on those people, you fire back." It was an order no soldier should ever have to give, but that's what the moment demanded, and his men, Lawrence Colburn and Glenn Andreotta, didn't hesitate. They trained their M60 machine guns toward the troops below, ready to defend the very people their army had come to destroy. Slowly, Thompson stepped out of the helicopter. He walked across the field, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The ground was scattered with the dead, old men, women, children, some still clutching one another as if hiding from the sun. Every few steps he felt the weight of what was happening press harder on his chest. He found a group of villagers, maybe 10 of them, crouched in a ditch, trembling, half covered in mud. A woman held a bleeding child in her arms. Thompson knelt beside her. He didn't speak Vietnamese, but he didn't need to. His voice softened as he said, "It's okay. We'll get you out." He waved for his crew. "Call in the other helicopters. We're evacuating them, all of them." Within minutes, the sound of more rotor blades filled the air. One by one, survivors were lifted from the killing field. Children first, then the wounded, then anyone strong enough to climb aboard. Some clung to Thompson's arms as he helped them up, their faces blank with shock, their eyes searching his for answers he didn't have. By the end of the rescue, they had saved a dozen lives, maybe more. But for every person airlifted out, dozens lay still. And Thompson knew nothing could undo what had already been done. When he returned to base that afternoon, his helicopter reeked of fuel, gunpowder, and blood. He filed an immediate report of what he'd seen. The bodies, the civilians, the orders ignored. But when he handed it in, the officer barely looked up. "Noted," was all he said. There were no medals, no recognition, just silence. Because no one wanted to hear that American soldiers had killed unarmed villagers, and that one of their own had pointed his guns to stop them. Thompson didn't care about the politics or the headlines that would follow years later. He cared about the faces. The woman who'd clutched his sleeve, the child who'd stopped crying once the helicopter lifted off, the people who were alive simply because he'd refused to look away. That day, he didn't win a battle. He stopped one. And that, in the middle of a war that had lost its meaning, was the bravest thing anyone could do. 30 years had passed since the screams of My Lai had faded into the jungle. The world had moved on, cities rebuilt, generations born, yet for Hugh Thompson Jr., the noise of that morning never truly stopped. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. Women huddled in ditches, children crying, men begging for mercy. The smell of gunpowder and blood still clung to the edges of his memory like smoke that refused to clear. After the war, Hugh went home to a country that didn't want to talk about My Lai. In 1969, when the massacre was exposed, the public turned its eyes in horror, but not toward the men who stopped it. Many called him a traitor for turning his guns toward fellow Americans. He received hate mail, death threats, and even mutilated animals left on his porch. He was branded as disloyal, a soldier who had betrayed his own. But Hugh never regretted what he did. "If stopping the killing of innocent people is treason," he once said quietly, "then I guess I'm a traitor." For decades he carried that wound in silence. He left the Army in 1983, retired to Louisiana, and lived a quiet life, still haunted by the memory of the villagers. He wondered if anyone had survived, if the children he airlifted had grown up, if they remembered the man in the helicopter who told them to run. Then, in the late 1990s, an invitation arrived from Vietnam. The government had tracked down the survivors of My Lai, and they wanted Hugh to visit. The villagers remembered him, not as an invader, but as the man who had saved them when everyone else turned against them. Hugh hesitated. Returning meant facing ghosts he'd carried for 30 years. But deep down, he knew he had to go, not for recognition, not for redemption, but for peace. In March of 1998, Hugh Thompson stepped off a plane in Vietnam. The air was thick with humidity, the same scent of soil and rain he remembered. As he looked out across the countryside, the landscape that had once been his battlefield was now peaceful, lush green fields stretching under a calm sky. When he arrived at My Lai, he was met not with anger, but with open arms. The villagers, many now old, their faces lined by decades of time, gathered to greet him. Some held photographs of family members who had never returned. Others held his hands, tears streaming down their faces. They remembered the helicopter, the man shouting for them to hide, the rotor wash that carried them away from death. One elderly woman approached him slowly. She was trembling as she reached out and touched his arm. Through an interpreter, she said, "I remember your face. You told us not to be afraid." Hugh's eyes filled with tears. He bowed deeply, unable to speak. For years he had feared that his presence in that village had only brought pain. But here he found something else: gratitude. The villagers led him to a small memorial built where the massacre had taken place. Flowers, incense, and photographs lined the stone monument. Hugh knelt before it, laying down a wreath. For a long time he said nothing. Then, softly, he whispered, "I'm sorry for what my people did. I tried to stop it. I never forgot." A hush fell over the crowd. And then, one by one, the villagers stepped forward and placed their hands on his shoulders. No words, just forgiveness. That day, something shifted in Hugh Thompson. The guilt he'd carried for so long began to loosen its grip. He realized that even in the darkest corners of history, compassion could survive. He hadn't come as a soldier or as an American. He had come as a human being, returning to the place where humanity had once been lost. As the sun dipped behind the rice fields, Hugh stood beside the survivors, their hands joined in silence. It wasn't victory or vengeance that filled the air. It was peace, the kind that takes a lifetime to find. That night, after the ceremony, Hugh sat alone outside his small guest house in My Lai. The air was still, broken only by the distant sound of crickets and the soft rustle of the rice fields. The same moon that had once watched over fire and death now glowed gently over a village reborn. He looked down at his hands. They were old hands now, scarred, lined, worn from years of work and quiet living. But as he stared at them, he could still see the controls of his helicopter, still hear the voices of his crew over the radio, the panic in their tone, the disbelief at what they had witnessed that day. Back then he had been 24, young, loyal, and proud to wear his country's uniform. He believed in duty, in honor, in protecting the innocent, but nothing could have prepared him for My Lai. On that morning in 1968, he had taken off with his two crewmates, Glenn Andriotta and Larry Colburn, on what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission. As they flew over the village, the first thing they saw was smoke, then bodies, dozens, maybe hundreds. At first he thought there had been a battle, that maybe Viet Cong had ambushed U.S. troops, but then he saw it: women, children, the elderly, all lying in the mud, unarmed. He hovered lower, trying to understand, and then he saw the soldiers, his own countrymen, moving from hut to hut, firing into the thatched roofs, dragging people out. It was chaos, a storm of bullets and screams. He circled once more, hoping there was some mistake, but there wasn't. "My God," he had said into his radio, "they're killing civilians down there." He landed his helicopter between the soldiers and the villagers. He got out and walked straight into the line of fire, waving his arms. "Hold your fire," he shouted. "You'll kill these people." One of the soldiers turned his rifle toward a group of women hiding in a trench. Hugh didn't think. He ordered his gunner, Larry Colburn, to aim at the Americans. "If they fire on those people," he said, "you fire back." For a moment the world held its breath. Then, slowly, the rifles lowered. The massacre stopped, at least for that small group. Hugh and his crew gathered survivors, terrified children, bleeding mothers, old men too weak to stand, and airlifted them to safety. It was an act that saved lives, but it also marked him forever. When he returned to base and reported what he'd seen, he expected outrage, an investigation, justice. Instead, he was told to keep quiet, to forget it ever happened. But how do you forget something like that? Years later, when the world finally learned about My Lai, Hugh was called before Congress. He spoke calmly, his voice steady but heavy. He told them what he had seen. Some called him brave, others called him a liar. One congressman told him he was worse than the men who pulled the trigger because he had betrayed his brothers in arms. Hugh never forgot those words, but neither did he let them define him. Sitting in that quiet Vietnamese night 30 years later, he thought about the irony of it all. The people he'd saved had forgiven him, yet the country he fought for had taken decades to understand what he did. He wasn't a hero. He never saw himself that way. To him, it was simple. What happened that day was wrong, and someone had to stop it. But he often wondered how many others could have done the same, and didn't. In the distance, he could hear laughter coming from one of the houses, children's voices. Life had returned to My Lai. The fields were green again, the village was alive. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. When Hugh Thompson returned home from Vietnam for the second time, he didn't come back as the man who had left. In his first return, decades ago, he'd carried the weight of war, the guilt, the confusion, the disbelief in what he'd seen. But now, after standing again in the village of My Lai, after seeing the faces of those who had survived, something inside him had shifted. He no longer felt the same gnawing shame that had haunted him through the years. The nightmares still came sometimes, the screaming, the gunfire, but when they did, they ended differently. Now he saw the faces of the children smiling. He saw the people he saved, not the ones who were lost. When he arrived back in America, reporters met him at the airport. They wanted headlines, drama, heroism. But Hugh only said, "I just did what was right." He meant it. For him, there was no glory in what he'd done, only a responsibility that every soldier should carry. He often thought about how the world had changed since 1968. Wars had come and gone. People had learned, forgotten, and learned again what war does to the human spirit. But he also saw how history could fade, how lessons could be lost in the noise. That's why he decided to keep telling his story, even when it hurt. In schools, he would speak softly, never sensationalizing what happened. He would tell the students about the day he saw American soldiers killing unarmed civilians, and about how he had to make a choice, whether to follow orders or to follow his conscience. "You'll all face moments in your lives," he'd tell them, "when doing the right thing might make you stand alone. That's when you find out who you really are." He wasn't preaching. He was remembering. For years, he and his surviving crewmate, Larry Colburn, attended memorial events together. They'd sit quietly at the back, shaking hands, answering questions, and sometimes just watching the faces of young veterans trying to understand what it meant to live through something like that. Glenn Andreotta, their third crewmate, had died just weeks after My Lai, shot down in another mission. Hugh often thought about him, how it was Glenn who first spotted the movement in the ditch that day, the sign that people were still alive. "There are still some down there," Glenn had said. Without him, those survivors might never have been found. So, when Hugh spoke publicly, he always said, "we," never "I," because he knew that none of them could have done it alone. Recognition came late. It wasn't until 1998, the same year he returned to My Lai, that Hugh, Larry, and Glenn were awarded the Soldier's Medal, the U.S. Army's highest award for bravery, not involving direct combat. Some people said it was too late. Others said it was unnecessary. But to Hugh, it wasn't about medals. It was about acknowledgement, an understanding that decency in war should be honored, not forgotten. When he stood on that stage to receive the medal, he looked out over the crowd and said, "The truth is, there were no heroes that day. There were only human beings, some who remembered their humanity, and some who lost it." In the years that followed, Hugh's health began to fade. The years of stress, the burden of memory, they all took their toll. Yet, even as his body weakened, his spirit never did. In 2006, when he passed away at the age of 62, the villagers in My Lai held a ceremony for him. They burned incense, rang bells, and placed flowers beneath a photograph of the man who had once descended from the sky to save them. In their village hall, they hung that picture beside the names of their ancestors, and beneath it, a small plaque read, "He risked his life to save ours." For them, Hugh Thompson wasn't a soldier or an American. He was a man who had remembered what it meant to be human when others had forgotten. And perhaps that was his final victory. Because in a world that too often measures courage by the number of enemies defeated, Hugh's story reminds us of a different kind of bravery, the courage to stop the killing, to question, to care. Long after he was gone, his name continued to echo quietly in classrooms, in documentaries, in the hearts of those who believed that compassion could survive even the worst of wars. And in the fields of My Lai, where the grass now grows tall and green, the villagers still tell their children about the man in the helicopter who came not to fight, but to protect. They say that on some mornings, when the mist drifts over the rice paddies and the sun hits the old memorial stone just right, you can almost hear the faint hum of a rotor far above, like a ghost in the sky, watching, guarding, making sure the world remembers. Because Hugh Thompson Jr. didn't just change the course of one massacre. He proved that even in war, humanity can still take flight.